It was the middle of June, and Einstein had just moved to Bern, Switzerland. It was a lovely evening, and Einstein was having a late dinner with two of his friends. A nearly full moon was shining through the window, and on the spur of the moment, they decided to walk up to Mount Girton. They hiked all through the night, arrived at the summit about dawn, time enough to marvel as the sun moved slowly toward the horizon and then to appear in all its grandeur and fill the Alps in an aura of early morning mystic rose. The year was 1902, and Albert Einstein was 23 years old. He picked up that walking habit very early in life, but one habit he never picked up was driving. Years later, his wife would tell a visitor, "Oh no, my husband, he never learned how to drive. It's much too complicated." It was in Munich that Einstein would live his early years, nurtured by his mother and father, Hermann and Pauline Einstein. Both parents were fond of literature, but it was his mother who really brought a cultural focus to the life of the family, and it was she who introduced the violin to her son when he was 6 years old, and before long, mother and son were playing duets together. Einstein didn't speak until a very late age, and there was some concern about his mental capacity. But he seemed curious in other ways. When he was 3 years old, he was building houses of blocks taller than he was. And when he was 5, he was building houses of cards 14 stories high. Already, his sense of concentration was very apparent. He recalls a stunning experience when he was about 5 years old. He said, "I was at home sick, and my father brought me home a small pocket compass. No matter which way I turned, that needle pointed in the same direction. It made a deep impression on me, and for weeks I carried it around in my pocket, and from time to time I would take it out and look up into the sky." Well, life was rich and comfortable at the Einsteins, and then came a difficult turn of events. His father's business failed, and they moved to Milan to open up another factory. Everybody goes to Milan except Albert. He's left behind to finish his last year at the gymnasium. One evening, he spent the whole night just roaming the streets of Munich. 3 days later, Albert Einstein drops out of high school. He feels free. He joins his family in Milan, and what follows is one of the most joyous times of his life. The 16-year-old Einstein takes a walking tour over northern Italy, and as he promised his mother, he wrote letters along the way. In that first letter he wrote, "Dear Mother, I can hardly believe my good fortune. It was only a month ago that I was lonely and miserable in school, and now I'm traveling through the most charming small towns and villages, many more than 1,000 years old, and everywhere I go, the Italian people are warm-hearted and spirited. I'll have many stories to share with you when I return." So he traveled on for another couple of months and then finally returns to the pleasure of his mother. And at this point, his father sits him down. He said, "Albert, it's time we have a father and son chat." His father says, "You know, Albert, your mother and I, we've let you do whatever you've wanted, and you've had a wonderful time. But now you're getting older. You got to think about how you're going to earn a living." Well, Albert doesn't like the gist of this conversation. But for the moment, he relents, and he accepts his father's advice to pursue a career in engineering. But at the same time, he says, "Father, I've had enough of Germany. I want to give up my citizenship." And his father agrees to help. And so Einstein is feeling very comfortable, and he makes plans to enroll in Zurich Polytechnic It's one of the fine universities in all of Europe, and you don't need a high school diploma to get in. All you have to do is pass the examination. Albert Einstein takes the examination. He fails. He's really disappointed, but a professor at the school, recognizing his ability, suggested that he go to a school called RU, which was about 15 miles outside of Zurich. And at RU, for the first time, Einstein thoroughly liked school. It's a warm and a caring faculty, and between his violin playing and his conversation and sense of humor, he's popular with the faculty and all his friends. And for the first time, he becomes a social animal. Well, while he's there, he received notice that he's no longer a citizen of Germany. And so when he applied and was accepted at Zurich Polytechnic the following fall, Albert Einstein was a young man without a country. But he was little concerned because after his last year at RU, he's all excited about going to the university. So Einstein actually did very well in college. And when he graduated, he was one of 4 students to qualify to get an assistantship at the university. His 3 classmates got the position. Einstein was rejected. His main professor said, "Oh, Einstein, you're clever, but you don't listen to anyone." And so he had a college degree, but he had no jobs. He sent out letters to schools all over the country. He didn't get a single reply. The first bit of good news came when he received notice that he was now a citizen of Switzerland. He'd made application for that when he started college. Otherwise, times were bleak. It was 2 years after he graduated college that finally good fortune would come his way. Marcel Grossman's father knew the director of the patent office in Bern and arranged for an interview, and he got the job. And in June of 1902, Einstein was appointed technical expert, 3rd class, on a trial basis. Finally, he had a job. It was not until 1909 that Einstein was appointed associate professor at the University of Zurich. He was very pleased to finally get a university job. A former student of Einstein talked about Einstein, the teacher. They said, you know, unlike almost all the other professors at the school, Einstein actually liked meeting with students. And after the weekly physics colloquium, we'd all walk down to the Terrassi Cafe and pull some tables together and talk for hours about the riddle of the universe or anything else that was on our minds. 2 years later, he'd move on to the German University at Prague. And the following year, the Gypsy Einstein would be appointed full professor at Zurich Polytechnic, where a dozen years before they had said, "Einstein, get out of here, we don't want you around." Well, by the time he got to Zurich Polytechnic, Einstein was recognized as one of the giants in all the history of science. And so the stage was set for high drama when Max Planck and Walter Nernst, 2 Nobel Prize winners, came down from Berlin to lure Einstein to return to Berlin with them. There in his office and chatting, and Max Planck said to him, "Albert, your only responsibility is to do anything you want to do." Einstein said, "I have to think about it." So they didn't want to hang around Zurich and be nervous for a couple of days, so they decided to take a little holiday while they were in Switzerland. So he saw them off at the train and he said, "Gentlemen, you'll know my answer as soon as you step down from the train when you return. If I'm carrying a white rose, I'm going to stay in Zurich. And if I'm carrying a red rose, I will join you in Berlin." 2 days later, they stepped down off the train, and they were delighted to see Einstein walking briskly up the platform, a red rose in the air. All through the 20s, Einstein was asked to speak at lots of organizations and universities. And in 1926, he was asked to give the main address at the German Physical Society. He talked about one of his latest theories. He'd been working on it for 7 months. And so he talked for an hour or so and filled the blackboard up with equations. And at the end of the hour, the chairman said, "Well, does anyone have any questions for Dr. Einstein?" In that room full of esteemed scientists from all over Europe, there was not a sound to be heard. And then from the rear of the room, a young man raises his hand. Turns out he was 18 years old. He said, "What Dr. Einstein has shared with us is quite marvelous. Only the second equation doesn't follow from the first. It needs an assumption which is not proven." Well, everybody turns around. Who is this kid challenging Einstein? But Einstein's not looking at the student. He turns around, he's looking at the blackboard. He spends a moment or so and then turns around and says, "What that young man in the back said is absolutely true. You can forget everything I told you today." There were many people very eager to meet Albert Einstein. Occasionally, it was a treasure for him as well. He was visiting in Belgium and was invited to the palace of King Albert and Queen Elizabeth. He wrote his wife Elsa about that trip. He said, "These two people are of a kindness and purity seldom found. First we talked for an hour or so, and then the Queen and I played trios and quartets with 2 other women. This went on merrily for several hours, and then the 2 ladies went home, and I stayed behind to have dinner with the King and Queen, vegetarian style, and there were no servants. We had a kingly meal of spinach, hard-boiled eggs, and potatoes, period. I like them very much, and I think they like me too." If there was a Nobel Prize for a gracious relationship between a man and a woman, it would be shared by Albert Einstein and Queen Elizabeth of Belgium. From the first time they met, they loved to write notes to one another wherever they happened to be. Einstein was visiting in Santa Barbara in 1931, and he discovered that the Queen had visited there some years before, and so he wrote her a note. "Dear Queen," he always called her Queen. "Dear Queen, it is 2 days I have been staying in this carefree corner where wind and heat and cold are unknown. Yesterday I was shown a dreamy villa where you spent a few happy, quiet days some years ago. It is now 2 months that I have been in this country of contradictions and surprises where one alternates between admiration and head shaking. One realizes that one is attached to the old Europe with all its problems and all its pains and returns gladly." 2 years later, almost to the day, he was back in Santa Barbara, and he sent the Queen a small twig and a short poem. And Einstein wrote, "In Cloister Garden a small tree stands, planted by your very hands. It sends its greetings to convey a twig, for it itself must stay." And the Queen responded in kind, and by this time the Nazis had taken over Germany and had confiscated his house and his bank account. And she was concerned about the welfare of her friend. And she sent a note playing on the theme of Einstein, which means one stone. And the Queen wrote, "The twig the greeting did convey from the tree that had to stay, and from the friend whose heart so big could send great joy by tiny twig. 1,000 thanks aloud I cry unto mountain, sea, and sky. Now when stones begin to shake, I pray one stone no harm will take. And once more, Einstein and his family set across a stormy Atlantic. And when his boat was about to go into New York Harbor, a tugboat came alongside, and 2 trustees of the Institute helped Einstein and his party aboard. And in a matter of minutes, he was taken to Princeton to a home rented for him. He had arrived in America for good. Einstein worked every day at the Institute except Sunday. And on his holidays, he always went sailing. He said, I like sailing because it's the sport that requires the least energy. The wind, water, and the sail, they do all the work. His friends talked about his utter disregard of danger. He loved to sail in rough weather, and on several occasions, he had to get towed in with a broken mast. His friends would get very upset with him because he absolutely refused to carry a life jacket on board, and true to his fashion, Albert Einstein, he never learned how to swim. A friend said, you had to see Einstein in a small skiff to appreciate the roots that connected him to a primitive life. For while he may gaze with awe at the stars, there was no time that he felt closer to the raw forces of nature when he was traveling across the ocean in the middle of a storm. And he wrote about such a storm in 1931. He said, never before have I lived through a storm like the one this evening. The sea has a look of indescribable grandeur, especially when the sun falls on it. One feels as if one is dissolved and merged into nature, and even more than usual, one feels the insignificance of the individual, and it makes one happy. He was also happy on October 1st, 1940, to raise his hand and become a citizen of the United States of America. In April of 1945, Einstein formally retired from the Institute. It made not the slightest difference in his working habits. That summer, he vacationed at his cottage on Lake Saranac. And on August 6th, the White House announced that an American warplane had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Helen Dukas, his secretary, had heard it on the radio and walked out to tell Einstein. He stood in stunned silence. Einstein had been in Japan in 1922, and he had friends there. And in March of 1947, he received a request to write an epitaph for 2 old acquaintances, Dr. Hayashi Miyake and his wife Miho Miyake. The aged couple, they had just turned 80, died 3 days before the end of the war in an air raid. Einstein sent these words, which were chiseled into their granite tombstone. Here lie Dr. Hayashi Miyake and his wife Miho Miyake. They labored together for the welfare of man, and they departed together, victims of human folly. Einstein said when he wasn't writing physics, his favorite thing was to write about education. And in 1952, he wrote a paper called Education for Independent Thought. And in that paper, he wrote, overemphasis on the competitive system and premature specialization on the grounds of immediate usefulness kills the spirit on which all cultural life depends, specialized knowledge included. The purpose of education is to nurture thoughtfulness. The lesser function of thinking is to solve puzzles and problems. The essential purpose is to decide for oneself what is of genuine value in life, and then to find the courage to take your own thoughts seriously. An assistant once asked Einstein how aging had affected his thinking. Einstein said, "Oh, I have as many ideas now as I've ever had. Only now, I can't tell which are the good ones." His sense of humor was legendary in the scientific community, and friends and colleagues would save up stories to tell him. He was particularly fond of stories that poked fun at his own ways. He was at a gathering one time, and somebody made some mention of his manner of dress, and he said, "Look, when I discovered that the earth was matter that expanded into nothing that was something, I want to tell you, wearing plaid with stripes was real easy." In all the history of human events, there was no greater dialogue than that which went on between Einstein and Niels Bohr about the meaning of the quantum. That went on for 30 years. Oh, how these two men adored one another. And what charming poetry that they would be granted the Nobel Prize one after the other, Einstein in 1921 and Bohr in 1922. It's no wonder that Einstein and Bohr were so enamored with children, for these two men remained childlike in their manner and in their thought through all their years. But when it came to physics, oh, they could argue. They were working on a problem one time. Nobody said a word for well over an hour. Suddenly, Einstein's head shot up and he said, "Oh, this is so beautiful, God could not have passed it up." And Bohr looked at him and said, "Einstein, stop telling God what to do." In March of 1955, Einstein would suffer one more sorrow. His dear friend Michelangelo Besso died. Besso, who he had thanked at the end of his paper on relativity 50 years before. Less than a month later, he signed a document written by Bertrand Russell. It urged all nations to renounce nuclear weapons. It was the beginning of the Pugwash scientific conferences that continue to this day. 2 days later, the Israel Council called on Einstein to discuss a statement he was writing in honor of Israel's 7th anniversary of independence. The government had asked him to write about Israel's cultural and scientific achievements, and Einstein said, "I think I should like to take this time to write about the nature of Arab-Israeli relationships." That had been his priority since the 1920s, and it was on that issue that he was writing on that Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, he collapsed. An aneurysm had ruptured. On Friday morning, he was taken to the hospital. Sunday evening, he appeared to be resting comfortably. Einstein loved fairy tales. He said, if you weren't deeply enamored with fairy tales, the possibility of being a first-rate theorist were practically nil. At one of his last public meetings, he told of a letter he had received from a group of school children in Michigan. It seems these youngsters were going to start a cookie business, and with the money they made from selling cookies, they were going to turn Washington, D.C. into a bird sanctuary. He got many letters from children, and almost always he wrote back, as he did in this case. And he wrote, "My dear young friends, I wish you well in your wonderful enterprise. As long as there are kids and cookies and stories, all things remain possible. Send me a box of one of those hopeful cookies. Yours truly, Albert Einstein." Thank you.